All right. So, welcome everybody. Jerry, can you hear us okay out there in the west?
Yep.
Excellent. That's good. All right. So let me bring up hopefully the here. And today, if the audio is not there, Matt can just throw something at me. Kick me under the table, as the case may be. Okay, so let's see how we go. And one good thing about having one screen, it's not trying to put something under there. Okay, so here we are at week 12, at final days of our Pentateuch subject. And we're going to have a chance later this afternoon to have a conversation with Richard Sewell, who's the Dean of St George's College, and we'll be, one amongst the things I'll be asking Richard to reflect on is how he sees these biblical traditions from the Pentateuch playing out in the, I guess, the politics of Jerusalem and Israel and West Bank in the present period. Lynn, would you mind putting that blind down behind? I'm just getting a whole whack of sunlight. That'll be good. I won't have to squint and screw my eyes up in that direction. Okay, so we'll get into our process. The graphic that I've chosen as kind of our theme graphic for this week is, of course, an image of Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus is the massive, large codex or book of the Bible, which was found at in the library at St. Catherine's, Mount Sinai. I've been in that library, but the book had long since gone, and the monks were rather nervous about having foreign biblical scholars there. This is one of the great 4th century manuscripts or copies of the Bible. It has all sorts of interesting things about it in terms of the history of the book, which actually must remember some of this for the Intro to Biblical Languages subject next semester. You'll notice it's written in narrow columns. There are 4 columns per page, as if they're still writing on parchment or on a scroll. And with a scroll, you would sort of rule it up into some columns about 3 to 4 inches wide, which are basically the width of an adult male thigh, because that's your portable writing desk. Okay, and still to this day. And then when they started to produce them, not as scrolls, but when somebody got the idea of chopping the scroll into leaves, making a stack and binding them on one edge, people still wanted it to look like a real scroll. We have this problem all the time in church, but it has to look like the way we used to do it. And so that's the reason, if you look up an encyclopedia or a dictionary or some other reference book in English, probably true in other European languages as well, it tends to be in columns because it makes it look serious. Whereas if you're reading a novel, the lines go all the way across the page. So you get this kind of, it's a coding in a sense that says this is a serious book. Once upon a time, it would have been a scroll. And so it's a book you go to for information. This particular book is the oldest or the only substantial book to have survived from the Roman Empire and still be intact. And it's a Christian Bible. That's interesting. It's got basically the whole of the Old Testament, including the Apocrypha, of course, because it's a Greek Bible. And it has all of the New Testament. But what people normally forget to say when they say this is the earliest example of the New Testament is that the New Testament in Codex Sinaiticus is not limited to the 26 books in our New Testament. Okay, in other words, the New Testament canon, at least for the people in Egypt, was not the same as it is for us. So yes, all the books that we recognize as New Testament are in this volume, but so are some extra books as well, like the Shepherd of Hermas and so on, which eventually dropped out of the New Testament. So this represents a window when the Bible was emerging but had not yet reached the form that we know it in the West. Just as at Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, the great Psalm scroll is the same as our book of Psalms up till I think it's 109. And then after that it has different Psalms. So around about 100 BC, whatever, the book of Psalms was not yet in the version that we know it. So these were still plastic. They were still malleable in terms of what was in and what was out. It also is a manuscript which has corrections on it and in it. So people have been using it and noticing mistakes, and they've tried to make little corrections either in the actual line or just in the margin. Depending on what sort of resolution you have, you can actually read those marginal comments and corrections. The other thing about Sinaiticus is that it's broken up into sections for reading in the lectionary. So the lectionary system, a lectionary system, is already in place because the biblical text is already broken up and numbered to be read in portions. So that again is something that goes back a long way. Finally, we know that when Constantine, one of the things Emperor Constantine did was he ordered 50 copies of the Bible to be prepared, and he gave one to each of the 50 most important bishops in the Christian church in the early 4th century. This may well be one of those books. It's from the 4th century, and it's a massive undertaking to produce something like this. So this may well be one of the 50 copies of Constantine's Bible, but it has survived more or less intact until Count Tischendorf came and borrowed it to do some study and never brought it back. The monks had never given us for nicking.
What time frame are we?
Second half of the 19th century.
Oh, wow, that's quite recent.
Yeah. He was going through the library, cataloguing stuff, and came across this. Wow.
Yeah.
And took it. So I need to check. I'll bring it back in a few weeks or a few months, whatever. He actually gave it to the Tsar of Russia as a gift, and then the British government purchased it off the communists in the 1920s, 1930s, because they were short of cash. And the British government purchased the Sinaiticus from the Soviet era government that didn't have any interest in it. A portion of it had also ended up in Germany. And actually, there's a little bit of it still in Sinai that Tischendorf missed. And they're not letting that out of their sight.
Was it now the British Museum?
Yeah, it's in the British Museum. They paid like £5,000 for it.
Is it on display or hidden away that no one can see it?
I couldn't actually tell you that.
But they acknowledge
I mean,
it.
the average person is not going to be able to go and touch it.
No.
But if you go to codexsinaiticus.com, I think it is, the British Museum, the Russian Museum, the German Museum in Leipzig or somewhere, and the monks at St. Catherine's are now collaborating to make the entire Sinaiticus available in digital form.
Oh, wow.
And so you can actually zoom in and look really closely at really good quality facsimiles. So there's a whole story in there about books and Bibles and lectionaries and canon and colonial politics and post-colonial pushback and so on. So it's, yeah. And of course, St. Catherine's Church at Sinai is the oldest continuously used Christian church anywhere in the world. Okay, it's never been destroyed, burnt down, interrupted. So it's actually the longest running uninterrupted Christian church anywhere in the world. So there's just so many fascinating aspects to the story of Sinaiticus. So here we are at the end. So again, we had some reading material during the week, particularly Brueggemann and Dozeman. Brueggemann's section, the section from Brueggemann was looking at reception history basically, and the way that the Torah, the Pentateuch, has influenced subsequent periods in history. And I'm going to do some of that today as well, but do it in a slightly different way to overlap. I'm not so interested in the impact on the American Revolution, but as Brueggemann or Dozeman was. But it's still, that in itself is an interesting question. But so final opportunity, I guess, for reflections and questions out of the reading material we've been working with.
The Brueggemann was really interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting passage.
Yeah.
I'm rereading it today.
I mean, anything by Brueggemann, you've got to read 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
Because he writes in English, but he thinks in German. And so the sentences are long and complex.
I had Google open on my phone as well to translate the English I didn't understand.
Yeah.
But, in any serious courtroom trial, testimony is challenged by other competing testimony. In any serious trial, no one challenged testimony and expect to carry the day easily. Yeah,
and that's so can people hear what Matt is saying? So I keep looking up there, but actually you're actually showing up on my laptop screen, so I'll just try to look at the screen. Matt was making the point that comes out of Brueggemann about testimony, and testimony has to be challenged and tested against alternative accounts. So if somebody thinks they've seen an accident and they describe it, the court doesn't take that point of view without checking whether anybody's got literally a different angle on what happened, and then the court. So in history, as in the law, we very rarely have absolute proof of anything, but we have a test of probabilities. And so the historian is looking for what's the most probable explanation based on the evidence we have at the moment, which obviously in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, prior to that point, people would say quite correctly, the oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible dates to roughly 1000 AD. And then all of a sudden we had hundreds of manuscripts, 200 and plus biblical manuscripts, and suddenly we're in a whole different place when it comes to talking about not only the history of the Bible, and the preservation of the text, but also ways in which the Bible was actually being used in the first century, which we didn't really have any access to previously. So the historian is, we'd love to think that our arguments were so watertight that they were final, done and dusted, and would never have been revised. But really, we're just looking at what's the balance of probability. And the alternative, of course, is that you have some other kind of source of truth which is not able to be challenged and is not subject to verification. And there are Christians who have those kinds of understandings of authority, whether the fact that it's in the Bible, that's it, that settles it, or the fact that the Pope has made a declaration settles it, or their favourite preacher said it, so that's it, done and dusted kind of thing.
When was this written? Because he said that about Roman Catholics, that my mind wandered over to some of the Pentecostals are that way now as well. So when I'm just trying to check when he actually wrote this passage.
Yeah, well, with modern Pentecostals, it's more the personal charisma of your favourite pastor.
Yeah,
and of course, there are beloved, highly esteemed New Testament and theological authors who almost have that kind of status.
Yeah.
For instance, for some people, Tom Wright is in effect such a person. If Tom Wright says it, then it's right. An earlier phase it would have been if that was William Barclay had said this, because he was so esteemed and so on. So, or William Temple, one of the previous archbishops of Canterbury, and so on. So we have had people who were so esteemed. One of the points that either Brueggemann or Dozeman made is that prior to the last, I think, I'm not sure which one it was now, but prior to the last couple of decades, there were only ever a handful of standout powerful theological interpreters. It might have been Karl Barth, it might have been Paul Tillich, it might have been Gerhard von Rad. But if they said it, nobody challenged it.
Yeah,
they were the ones who wrote the textbooks. The rest of us studied the textbooks. I mean, say John Macquarie, I'm in that generation of clergy for whom the Principles of Christian Theology by John Macquarie was the theology. And that was true for about 30 years. So it's really interesting to having come to St Barnabas College in Adelaide when I was on faculty there and meet this little Scottish guy. He's a fascinating person, but he was like up there with God in my theological world. And he joked about having he'd like to do a Scottish liturgy in the chapel, by which he meant using scotch in the chalice instead of wine. But it was a joke, I think. Anyway, so you do. So that's part of, and that is also part of the ethos of. I would think most of the academic programs that are part of the University of Divinity are more likely to be seeing theological, biblical points of view as open for debate and needing to be argued for, not in a bad sense, but, there's a case to be made, whereas there'd certainly be theological colleges around Brisbane and in other parts of the country where the students are simply told this is the truth, these are the 5 steps to it, and there's nothing to question here. And that's where I started out, in that kind of college. So I've reacted, of course, by going the other way. Looking ahead to the end of the week, imagine there'll be a few dings on my computer on Friday afternoon as assignments come in. And just a reminder, I can only deal with extensions and so on up until the end of this week. And I've just checked this with Sheila because of a comment I heard her make the other day at a faculty meeting. So anything which is not able to be submitted by the end of this week, we have to get what's called a Dean's extension. So Peter Klein has to look at the case, and there'll be, presumably there's a form to fill in and a little story to write, a narrative theology to write about the dog ate my computer and whatever, my grandma's died and everything else. So I'll check again with Sheila what the process is, or maybe I could just go and look at the assessment policy. I suppose it's easier to ask Sheila. But so please try and get it in by this Friday. Saturday morning's cool. I mean, the weekend's fine. But by the time we get to next Monday, what I don't have, we'll have to be run past Peter. And there is scope to give people significant leeway if there are pressing reasons. But we do need to try and get it in, done and dusted, and off your desk.
And the resubmission one, we're literally just putting it into the same.
Yeah, I've changed the configuration for that assessment item so it allows multiple documents. But the second one knocks the first one out of the way.
Okay.
I think is what it was telling me.
Yeah, I have to admit I didn't go in though.
If in doubt, just email it to me anyway.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Now maybe I'm naive, but I know at the beginning of the semester I gave a very serious and earnest talk about generative AI and how I was going to interrogate each of you at some point during the semester. And it's not just that I'm tired. In fact, I'm not tired. Now that my diabetes is under control, I'm dangerously energized, so watch out. Zoe Everett, the Archdeacon for the South in Grafton, said, "Oh my God, Greg, no, we don't want you with your old energy, please." My view is that I know you well enough and we've been engaged in conversation enough during the last 3 months that I will recognise what is your own work. So I'm not going to do that. Tell me where this paragraph came from or what it means.
Actually, on that, one thing I was thinking of, it's all my own work, by the way, but one comment I was going to make is when we resubmit this, because it's going to see our old assignment and turn it in, it's going to have an extraordinarily high turn it in.
That'll be interesting.
It will be
see, I
hard.
haven't actually learned how to use the data and turn it in yet.
I'm pretty
But
sure
I
it
know
will
it shows
return.
up with different colour codes depending on how much of the material is on
Yeah.
it. So you could get a bright red.
Yeah, so I'm just putting that out there because, I mean, I have
Yeah.
changed, like,
Of course, but it's overlapping.
Yeah.
Recently.
Yeah. I mean, it will have some things that's exactly the same because
Alternatively, just email it to me.
I'm happy to submit it. I'm just
Yeah,
saying
okay.
that's going to happen, right?
Okay, so
Or I can email it to you, whatever you want, but I'm just.
whatever's going to make you feel most comfy. Is that kind of guy.
I wouldn't even know how to get into AI, Greg.
Well, I think that's
It
good
is.
to hear. As of today, my email program has generative AI embedded in it.
Yeah.
So I can now say, write an email to Matt saying, I don't care, and it will draft the email to you.
Actually, it's scarily good. I had someone try to sell me the idea of, and I said no, and I said, look, you've got to understand, you might be looking at theology from this opinion or that opinion. Is this to give me a draft case? I can't remember what I gave him, but I thought it was quite obscure. Half an hour later, he's got an assignment. I made it up. And then half an hour later, he's got this assignment. Looking at it from beyond. Yeah, no.
And I wouldn't have taken half an hour.
No.
Actually, while I was doing the local casino, so, September last year, thereabouts, Grant Sparks, who many of you will know, also known as Tiffany husband, I'm sure he loves that. But he's an IT guy and writes computer code, works for the Australian Army in terms of security and stuff. He contacted, because he was playing around with OpenAI, which is the chat GPT of the time. And he said, I want to ask it some theological questions, but it doesn't have a theological education. So do you mind if I load into my AI all your sermons and blog posts that are on your website? Because I want the AI to have some theological content so I can ask it questions. I said, that's fine. It's all up there on the web anyway. And then he sends me this stuff where it's purporting to be me. Some of it is recognizable, that's what I would say, and some of it was just made up. Just totally made up. Like Greg Jenks said, the most exciting thing was when he found a coin at Bethsaida and he was holding in his hand something from the first century. I've never found a coin at Bethsaida. I look after the coins, but I've never found a coin myself. So it was just making stuff up. So
Making links between things. And
yeah, it is going to become, that's something you'll often read on the internet. The most exciting thing is when you find, so just put it all together. So anyway, AI is part of our world. So as I said, as of today, my email program has AI embedded in it. And one of the good things I've discovered already, I can say proofread, and it just goes through and fixes up all the typos, which is really good. Anyway, so I am actually looking forward to seeing the assignments and seeing where you've got to with your biblical and theological interpretive skills. It's going to be great to see that work. So looking forward to it. And all along the way, and certainly in this session towards the end as well, we'll be again thinking about how do we preach this stuff, or how does it inform our preaching, and how does it inform our ministry, our pastoral, our leadership, etc. Hopefully it does. Okay, so the things we're going to be focusing on are standing back a bit, as it were, and saying, now, how does the Pentateuch function as scripture in the life of the church? Okay? And bearing in mind that there's whole chunks of the Pentateuch we just studiously ignore. We don't go there at all. And yet we say it's scripture. We're going to be thinking about what I call lectionary Pentateuch. In other words, the bits of the Pentateuch which make it into the 3-year lectionary, and the bits that are left out. Surprising how much is left out. All through this, we want to be thinking about the Jewish otherness of particularly Pentateuch and what we call the Old Testament, because it's their Bible first. But even to say that would be profoundly annoying to some Christians, even to some Anglicans. It's their Bible, our Bible. Look, it's in my Bible, but it's a Jewish text. And just reflecting towards the end on overall outcomes. So we've already done some work on the final assessment. Okay.
Can I just take you back? You mentioned lectionary. I think, I'm sorry to jump back. I had trouble, still having trouble. You've loaded up a lectionary Bible index. I don't know if anyone else has trouble downloading that, but I'm having trouble downloading that.
The Excel file that's on the website?
Yeah. It might be my computer not set up, but I'm struggling to get it downloaded. I don't know if anyone else is.
Okay, we can just go to the website that I mentioned. Oh, it's in the lecture.
Okay, beautiful.
So, where did I see this recently?
Yeah.
And one of the links on the website is the file to download the lecture.
Lovely, thank you.
XLS. That's funny because I've never had any trouble downloading it.
Mine downloaded.
No, that's my computer.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Something set up.
There you go. That's raising the bar for you, Matt.
Take it off the website. Yeah, that's scary. Thanks, Jerry.
All right. Now, okay. So what I put up there is, I'll see if I can just change how your pictures are showing up on my computer. Okay, I'll just deal with them. What I've got there is actually a piece of Genesis, a small Genesis fragment from K4 at Kumara, so 4Q Genesis G. So what's that make it? Number 8 or number 9 from K4 of Genesis. 8, I think. Yeah. And actually, one of the amazing things, both about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also the documents or they're actually little bits of pottery, but the execrate, or what's the word for it? Masada, Josephus tells us that on the last night, before he was betrayed, on the last night before the Romans came and captured them all, the Jewish rebels killed each other, killed their wives and children, and then they designated 10 men who were going to kill all the other men, and then going to kill each other, and then one person would be left, had to kill himself, whatever. And I'll watch an interview video of an interview with Yadin, who was the excavator of Masada in the 1960s. And he describes finding these pieces of pottery, broken pottery, which we used as what we call scrap paper. And on these pieces, 10 or so pieces of pottery, there were names, 10 names, men's names. And also in what's called the Masada synagogue, and particularly in the little corner room where they kept the old Torah scrolls, he described finding the scrolls, and as they were coming out of the sand, he could read the Hebrew. Because just we can, you may or may not have enough Hebrew to recognize, but that's the first couple of sentences of the book of Genesis. And I can look at that and I can read it. It's not how I would write Hebrew, but I can recognize the Hebrew letters and make sense of the words. So imagine if you're actually a Hebrew-speaking Jewish person, to find 2,000-year-old manuscripts that you can read in your own handwriting is a very powerful point of connection. So this is the opening words of Genesis and indeed the Bible. So what I want to do in this first section is talk about the very earliest reception history. And reception history is a particular form of biblical and theological study where you're not so much worried about what are the words on the manuscript, but how are the different communities receiving and valuing and appreciating this manuscript. So, for example, a friend of mine called David Cohen, who despite his last name is a Baptist minister, not a Jewish priest, he teaches at the Baptist College in Perth, which is now part of Morling College from Sydney. And his PhD research is looking at the ancient manuscripts, but looking at them in terms of when the scribes have made changes, what does that tell us about how they were understanding the text? So not using the manuscripts to try to recover the perfect original, which is the historical impulse, Western scholarship, but rather with each manuscript appreciating it as an artifact that reflects how a particular community at a particular point in time modified or explained the text in order to fit their situation. So reception history is how did this idea, how did this text, how did this belief come to be received and embraced and affirmed by the church, or indeed by the synagogue. So in the case of the Pentateuch, I'm not talking about the Old Testament, the Tanakh so much, although it actually is kind of the same for our purposes. The earliest pointing to the reception of the Pentateuch is presumably the creation of the Greek translation, which is roughly 250 before the Common Era. The problem is we don't have any manuscripts of the Septuagint prior to Codex Sinaiticus. When people say, oh, it's in the Septuagint, well, the Septuagint is Sinaiticus, it's Vaticanus, it's Alexandrinus, and there's a couple of other minor scraps of Greek translations, but we don't have a copy of the Septuagint. But we know that it was around because it's talked about. So the fact that people were taking the trouble to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek to be used by the Jewish diaspora community in Alexandria, Egypt, indicates that the Pentateuch was there and was valued by these people. Now, there are all sorts of legends around how the Septuagint got to be written and so on, but putting those aside, the fact that the translation of the Hebrew scriptures was made into Greek around about the middle of the 3rd century BCE means that the Pentateuch has to be earlier than that in terms of a piece of literature being formed. Okay. We'd love to have a much older Greek copy, but we don't have one at the moment. It's not to say they won't find one. Then you've got what I'm calling inner biblical referencing. And in this case, I'm pointing to the book of Sirach, or Ben Sirach, or the Wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, and there's all these different names for the same document. Now, this particular person, Jesus, the son of Sirach, and so to avoid confusion with a certain other Jesus, we tend to call it Ben Sirach, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, or just Sirach. From reference, what you got there is a book, again, which was originally written in Hebrew, and then the grandson of this guy, who's now living in Egypt, translates it into Greek. Now he's doing that roughly about 130-ish BCE, and his grandfather is writing the original of Sirach about 180, which means it's just after the Ptolemies have lost control of Palestine in the Battle of Banias in 199, and it's just after the country has come under the control of the Seleucids, but it's before the crisis of the Maccabean rebellion and Antiochus IV. So it's in that time. So it's before the Maccabean crisis. And this is from the prologue. Like to move that. I've got pictures hanging down over the text. Anyway, so this is the grandson speaking. Many great teachings have been given to us. I'll read it off the wall. Have been given to us through the law and the prophets, and that's a really important phrase. The law, it's the Pentateuch, folks. The law and the prophets. Okay? But he's saying many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. but they don't yet have an official name. Okay? And for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. And then it's got this note. Now those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able through the spoken and written word to help the outsiders. It's not a description of a graduate outcome from a Bachelor of Theology, or a description of a pastor in a parish. So, I love this phrase. So, my grandfather Jesus, remember Jesus is just Joshua. It's not a special name at this point in time. My grandfather Jesus, who had devoted himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors, had acquired considerable proficiency in them and was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that by becoming familiar also with his book, those who love learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. So clearly by this point in time, the Pentateuch is not only, does it exist as a document on the library shelf, but it's actually being read and studied. And even the commentary, as it were, on the Torah is being translated into Greek by Jesus' grandson. Okay. So that's what I call inner biblical, because in the Greek Bible, Sirach is part of the Bible. No, it's not in the Jewish Bible, Hebrew Bible, but it is part of the Old Testament in the Greek tradition and in the Latin tradition, and also in the Anglican tradition as a kind of second tier. And then a little bit later on, this is what in one of the passages I asked you to read this week, Sirach 24, you've got this long hymn about wisdom, Sophia in Greek. But as you get down towards, so the first, like 11 and 12, it's the idea that God loved this figure of wisdom, Lady Wisdom, so much that God provided a place for Sophia to live, and she made her home in Jerusalem. She took root in an honoured people, and so on. And then in verse 23, all this is in the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us. So it's almost, probably not quite, but almost that the Torah is an incarnation of the eternal wisdom, which is the great character in the wisdom literature. So whereas traditionally wisdom literature was not interested in covenant, was not interested in revelation, and was more interested in observation and reason, by the time you get to Sirach, these traditions are starting to marry. And the very essence of wisdom is to be found in the law of Moses, which if nothing else, it says, wow, by roughly 200 BC, here is somebody living in Jerusalem for whom the Torah is not only really important, it's almost a kind of incarnation of divine wisdom, which it's not going to take long before the rabbis say, God wrote Torah in heaven, and it came down from heaven to Moses fully intact. And that's going to be where the sort of Jewish tradition is going to go with the spiritual integrity of the Torah. So there can be no doubt that by, say, 200 BCE, at least in certain elite educated circles, the Torah was already on something of a pedestal. It was there, and it was highly regarded, hugely highly regarded, and was already being the object of intensive reflection and study, which is surely the very essence of becoming scripture. When people start to read you and write commentaries about you, then you've made it as a biblical book. But there's more. Do you want prize? Okay. So then we go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, keep an eye on the time frame here. So the Septuagint, best we can tell, is roughly 250-ish. Now again, it's probably more accurate to say during the 3rd century, the sacred writings of the Jewish community began to be translated into Greek, rather than 70 old geezers went off to a motel by the Suez Canal, and at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, they had created this Greek translation. That's a lovely legend, but it's reflecting a fact that through this period, you get the emergence of a parallel version of the Jewish sacred writings in Greek. And I think it's fair to say nothing like that had ever happened before. These books are so important as books that they get translated into another language because the Jewish people in the Hellenistic period could no longer speak Hebrew. In fact, they stopped speaking Hebrew centuries before the conquest by Nebuchadnezzar. So 250-ish, the Septuagint. 200, 180, you've got Sirach. Then you've got the Dead Sea Scrolls between 150 BCE and 70 CE. So the scrolls are hidden in the caves as the Roman 10th Legion is marching towards Qumran from Jericho. So we know when they stopped writing the scrolls, because we know when it was captured. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, so you come down another generation or so after Ben Sira, and indeed several generations after that. We have 22 copies of Genesis. So it's 22 different documents which represent portions of Genesis. We have 17 portions of Exodus. We have 16 pieces of Leviticus. Not a big surprise given the kind of people who were living at Qumran. They were into all this ritual stuff. We have 11 examples of the Book of Numbers, and we have 33, as we saw last week, 33 copies of Deuteronomy. Now, it's not the whole 34 chapters, but we have 33 different manuscripts which are recognized as separate documents, and each of them has at least a portion of Deuteronomy, and one of them is the one that's in the sidebar. Okay? So over the 150 years or so before the time of Jesus, and maybe during the next few decades as well, we've actually got not simply people talking about Torah, it's what we get in Sirach, we actually get copies of the Torah. And it's all 5 books. It's not just Genesis or it's not just Deuteronomy, it's all 5 books are represented. So again, that really locks in the idea that there's this emergence. Sort of around the corner out of sight, you've got the Septuagint, and then you've got the offstage, as it were, reference to the law of Moses in Sirach, and then at Qumran we actually get literally dozens of copies of the books that make up the Pentateuch. And not only that, but they are extremely accurate in terms of agreeing with the exact wording of those books as we have them. And that's actually their most significant contribution, is they let us see how well managed the document transition process was, despite it all being done manually. You know how hard it is to copy something across if you're making notes for your essay, and even just to correctly copy a paragraph from Brueggemann and put it onto your scribble pad. They're doing this with scrolls and ink and all the rest. But there's more. One of the documents from the 4th cave at Qumran is what's called Triple MT, and this is an halakhic letter. So a letter relating to halakha. Halakha is so there are 2 Hebrew words that are important in terms of religious literature. There's Haggadah, which are telling stories, and Halakha or Halakha, which is what you've got to do, the actual practice and the instruction, what you're going to do. So we have what's called the halakhic letter from the leader of the Qumran sect, probably around about 150 to 130 BCE, to the high priest in Jerusalem, explaining why we don't come to your services anymore at the temple, because you're not doing stuff properly. In particular, they've changed the calendar, and this was a serious concern, even bigger than changing the prayer book. So this is just an extract from this document. So think about this. We know there was a group of people who went off and set up some kind of community at Qumran. And we've got their buildings, we've got their industrial area, we've got their dining room, we know what their crockery was like. We know they were absolutely obsessed with ritual bathing, even though they're in the desert. But better still, we've actually got a letter from the leader of the community to the high priest in Jerusalem explaining the points of difference between the two communities. In this case, the bit I've highlighted is where he says, we've written to them so that you might understand the book of Moses, the books of the prophets, and David. David there is probably meaning the Psalms, basically. In other words, by the time of this letter, the most substantial document in the other books that followed them was the Psalms. And then it goes on to say, in the events of the generations, in the book of Moses, it is written, da 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 da. So here we have the leader of the Qumran community actually quoting the Pentateuch against the priest in Jerusalem. Like, that's pretty powerful stuff in terms of, and whenever I have groups of people with me in Israel, one of the things we do is say, it's one thing to have a sense of what kind of meal the Last Supper might have been, but to find the table where they sat or to find the crockery they used, that's a whole other level of historical detail we very rarely ever get. Yeah. And here we not only know about the Qumran community, we've actually got a letter from their leader telling the priest in Jerusalem why we don't see eye to eye, and quoting the book of Moses as the authority, and doing that in the context of Moses' prophets, David, which is effectively the three-part canon of the Jewish scriptures. Okay? So we can see this reception process beginning to unfold just in the century or so prior to the time of Jesus. Is that bring us time to stand? I don't think so. So, I'm just repeating what we've done because I had to split this up because of all the examples. So, we've got the Septuagint, we've got Sirach, we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Triple MT from Qumran, and then we've got the Samaritan Pentateuch. But the oldest copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch is from the 11th century. But we know that centuries earlier, the Samaritan community had split from the temple community in Yehud, in Jerusalem, in Judah, and their Bible only had the books of Moses. And they didn't ever accept the prophets, and they didn't ever accept the writings. So although the actual manuscript for the Samaritan Pentateuch doesn't outrank what we get from Qumran, the fact that we have this breakaway semi-Jewish community focused at Shechem, Nablus in today's terms, for whom the Bible stopped at Deuteronomy. That's a powerful piece of evidence for the idea that the Pentateuch was the foundational part of the Old Testament. and that it's happening before the Samaritans and the Judeans finally split. And that's basically after John Hyrcanus II attacks Mount Gerizim and burns down the Samaritan temple, which from memory is 102 BCE. So up until then, the two communities, as we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, were still kind of interacting quite a lot. And also the Elephantine letter from the Jewish mercenary community on the island of Elephantine in the Nile River, when they have a question about how to do Passover in Egypt, they write to the high priest in Samaria, as well as the high priest in Jerusalem. That's 4th century Persian period. By the time we get to John Hyrcanus, the Samaritans are being all but exterminated by the Jews. So they're not going to budge from then on. So the Pentateuch must already be so embedded in the Samaritans' religious landscape that for them, the Bible is the Pentateuch. And no matter what that tells us about the Samaritans, it tells us that the Pentateuch was rock solid sacred scripture for Jewish communities in the 2nd century. Then we get Philo. So Philo, if you look at him, is effectively a contemporary of Jesus. He doesn't die till about 40. He's born a couple of decades, perhaps earlier, 15, 20 years earlier than Jesus. But he's got a very different career path than Jesus. He's, of course, the great Jewish philosopher and scholar from Alexandria in Egypt, home of the Septuagint and of the Library of Alexandria. And he not only writes a book on the life of Moses, but he writes commentaries on different parts of the Pentateuch. Okay, so again, surprise, surprise, by the time you get to kind of the turn of the era with the life of Philo, there's absolutely no doubt that the Pentateuch is there, and it's a powerful influence, not only for people who are Jewish, but even for non-Jewish people when they think about Jews. They're going to know something about Moses. And as we saw last week, you really only hear about Moses in Exodus to Deuteronomy. You don't really learn about Moses from 2 Kings or Isaiah or the Psalms or whatever, despite 2 or 3 Psalms. And then you've got Josephus. Josephus is the rest of the 1st century. So he's born just a couple of years after Jesus dies. He's born into a wealthy priestly family in Jerusalem. And of course, at the time when the Jewish war breaks out in about 65, 65, 66, he's 35 years old, thereabouts, and he's actually the commander of Jewish forces in the Galilee at the beginning of the Jewish-Roman War, famously switches sides and becomes a Jewish political advisor to General Vespasian, and ultimately retires in Rome on a government pension, where he writes the history of the Jewish people and also the history of the Jewish war, as well as at least one other document. So he, again, in his Antiquities, so the Antiquities of the Jewish people, he's talking about Moses and the laws that the Jewish people were given through Moses. But this is no surprise, because we're now talking 80s and 90s of the 1st century. And then, just to wrap this up as another kind of example of all that, Luke 24, the famous Emmaus Road story, and I've got an extra, and some pop-up things that I really didn't need at the moment. So remember in Luke 24, the 2 disciples making their way to a village called Emmaus, the stranger joins them, and then you've got these couple of lines where beginning with Moses and all the prophets, this stranger, Jesus, interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. And then, the verse 44, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms, there's that same idea that we saw in Triple MT. The law, the book of Moses, the prophets, and David. So Luke is representing the same kind of tradition that we pick up in 4Q Triple MT, which is not only acknowledging the Pentateuch, but is also referencing the prophets and a further set of sacred writings, of which the most significant book is the book of Psalms. And indeed, of course, Psalms comes first in the Ketuvim, in the Jewish arrangement of their scriptures. So it's pretty clear by the time we get to Josephus and Luke, pretty clear that they share the same outlook in terms of what counts as scripture as what we saw not only in 4Q and Triple MT, we even saw it back in the prologue to Ben Sira, where he talks about the law and the prophets and those who came after them. So you've got that threefold kind of formation of what we would call the Old Testament. Okay? So that's a kind of an overview of the early reception history of the Pentateuch, and it's a kind of hopefully complements the discussion that we saw. I think it was in Dozeman where he talks about the way that the Torah had been received at various points in ancient history, but also in American history. Any comments, points for discussion, all of that? Okay. So I want to just set that against what we looked at way back in week 1, when I introduced you to the work by Jonathan Adler, which was only published last year, so it's pretty recent scholarship. And I've just picked up the slide from that first week, but let's just go through it again. So what Adler did, he's trying to work out where can we find evidence that Jewish people are actually practicing what the Pentateuch says they should be doing, which is distinct from what I've just been looking at, which is where do we find references to the book of Moses, or the law, or whatever. So, and he looked at, I think it was 7 different kinds of data: the dietary laws, laws about ritual purity, not having figural art. So you could have abstract art, but no representation of an animal or a human. The development of tefillin, which are the little container that has the Shema in it, that a Jewish man will put on his forehead and bind the cords around his arms before saying the prayers, and the metzazot, which are more or less the same thing, on the door as you go in and out of a Jewish house or in and out of a hotel in Israel. You'll find these little metzazot on the doors. When do we first find evidence for the synagogue? And by synagogue, we mean a place where Jewish people gathered to do their religious and other community business that they need to do. And then various other miscellaneous practices which are connected with Jewish identity. Now, in each case, he sort of worked the opposite way from what I just did. He started with what he calls first century texts, Philo, Josephus, and the New Testament. Because remember, everything in the New Testament is written by Jewish people. The one possible exception is Luke Acts, but whoever wrote Luke Acts, whether or not they were Jewish, they were immersed in the Septuagint and in the Jewish tradition. So they're not exactly outsiders in that sense. And so he says, well, by this point in the first century, everybody who says they're Jewish is doing all of these things. So let's push, and also we can find examples of synagogues and mitzvah, and we don't find statues and so on. So it all fits in the first century. Let's push it back. And so we went back through things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Elephantine community, a couple of pieces of information we have about the Babylonian diaspora community. And you remember what he came up with, cut it off, okay. What he came up with, I can not go too far here, was that he can't find any evidence of Jewish people doing Jewish stuff prior to 150. And his explanation was that the sort of Maccabean Hasmonean project, which is the aftermath of the Great Rebellion against Antiochus and so on, that in that, as part of that government program, they not only promoted the use of Hebrew, but they also promoted Torah as the defining document, as it were, for their sort of Jewish kingdom. And from that point on, it's quite clear. Prior to that, we can't find it. So that's the kind of essence of his argument there. So when I try to process all that and make sense of it, this is the kind of stuff that I come up with. I try to articulate this. So during the period, roughly a 500-year period, prior to the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. So technically that's actually more like 600. In 586, Nebuchadnezzar. By 500, you've got the exiles coming back and settling, with Haggai and Zechariah and so on. But certainly during that period, for several hundred years, you've got traditional material being shaped by what I'm calling distinctive communities of practice within Israel, which remember is a kingdom to the north of Jerusalem, and in the south, which is what we call the kingdom of Judah, or simply Yehud in the Persian period. And when I say communities of practice, I'm talking about things like, so what typically is talked about as the Yahwist or the non-priestly material, somebody's preserving that material, somebody's telling those stories. Now, some of them are stories that explain why a particular holy site is holy, what's called an etiological legend. Some of them are genealogies, some of them are very, legends about the founding mothers and fathers and so on. But there's a community of people for whom that stuff matters. I don't realize they're drafting the Bible, but there's a community of people that are telling those stories. And they have a different way of talking from the people who we identify as the Deuteronomists. So actually the Yahwist, the JE people, they're the hardest ones to put a finger on, I think. Whereas with D, with Deuteronomy, you can read the book of Deuteronomy. We can read Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. We can read the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah. We can see a coherent worldview, which is different from what we saw in the JE material, and it's going to be different from the priestly material. So the priestly material is pretty easy to identify. The material that comes, say, from the Deuteronomist or the Deuteronomistic school, that's relatively easy to recognize. You can hear the difference. And we can sort of work out who these people are in some way. The other voice, the Yahwist, I think is the more slippery devil. Who were these people? Where did they fit in? And I don't think we have an answer to that at this stage. A document that we would recognize as the Pentateuch, but they may not have been, well, they wouldn't have been calling it Pentateuch, but they might have been calling it the books of Moses or something, But a document that we would recognise as effectively the Pentateuch was finished at some stage during the Persian period. So if we accept the historicity of the tradition about a Greek translation being made in the middle of the 3rd century, then presumably the books already exist in Hebrew form at least 100 years before that. They're not, I think at one point, Adler might have suggested that actually the people who gave us the Septuagint also gave us the Hebrew text. And there's a certain logic to that. Who else is going to be doing this stuff? But presumably there's some, at least a small difference and maybe a significant difference between these books reaching their kind of finished form and when they get translated into Greek. If we read Ezra and Nehemiah, and particularly chapter 9 of Nehemiah, you get the impression that as early as Ezra and Nehemiah, the Pentateuch is there and everybody is signed on to it. But there's just no evidence that they did. So again, that might be, Ezra and Nehemiah, remember, is the end of the Chronicles, and the chronicler is another community of practice within ancient Judah. They have absolutely no time for the Northern Kingdom. They hate, talk about state of origin, they hate the Northerners, have no time for them at all.
It's funny when you read, like the research I've been doing for the exegesis in particular, that's that they all talk about all these different ways, and ultimately they say, but it's inconclusive. It's also a piece.
Well, it is inconclusive because it almost has to be
jumping at shadows
because the people that are pulling this together didn't realise they were writing the Bible. And Paul, when he's writing his letters to Corinth,
so like I said, in
he didn't think that
2,500 years' time, you want to have
the bottom of the world, which actually is a globe, there's a country called will be called Australia. And there'll be people there sitting, no idea of all that. But you've got to have a scribal class for any of this to happen. And to have a scribal class, you've got to have a certain amount of wealth. And you've got to have some spare resources, which could go into education and writing and paying people just to sit there scratching on parchment with a really bad ink nib. And the fact that, as we've seen on even that scrap of parchment there, it's actually, it's quite regular. I mean, the script is very well disciplined. These are professional scribes. Whereas, by distinction, the earliest manuscripts of the Greek New Testament are not professional scribes. They're scribbled by comparison. So the earliest existing copies of the New Testament manuscripts reflect a community that didn't have the resources that, say, the Qumran community had. Even though they're living out in the desert, we think they had nothing much to work with. So if you think of it as there being a black box, and eventually someone opens the black box or whatever, and you actually see what's come out of it, the black box is basically the Persian period. By the time you get to the end of the Persian period, Alexander the Great, 330 plus or minus a couple of years, things become much clearer. And within 75 years of Alexander the Great, we've got the Septuagint. Presumably the Hebrew was there even when Alexander was tromping around conquering the world, but of course he's not interested in a few Jewish scrolls in the back of the temple or whatever. It doesn't, that's not going to change the world, he would have said, had he been asked. So you've got this period of 500 to 600 years when stuff is it's in the washing machine going round and round, and various, what I'm calling communities of practice and they may be connected with particular holy sites. In the case of the Deuteronomists, it's because of the prominence that we find in Deuteronomy for the tribe of Levite and the Levitical priests, tends to suggest that this is where that stuff lives, those sort of people. And of course, the priestly material we also find in the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel is clearly people that live and dream about the temple and all that stuff. This is their sliced bread. So Persian period is kind of where it's all kind of beginning to come together. But I guess the critical thing I want to stress is it's coming together as a way for this community of Yahud, the people who find their identity connected with the temple in Jerusalem. These texts that are coming together are the texts that are expressing and shaping their sense of being the people of God. When there's no king and there's no prophet and there's no judge, then the scriptures emerge by the end of this period as the place of authority, in a sense. By 250, we've got the Pentateuch. By 150, you've got this idea that the Hasmoneans are really promoting Torah as part of their nationalistic Hebrew revival project. And then by about 100 BCE, you've got the Aramaic Targums. And the Targums are when this document is being read out in Hebrew, but nobody actually speaks Hebrew, what are you going to do? Well, if you're in Alexandria, you just read it out in Greek. But what if you're in Palestine? In Palestine or in Babylon, you have the Targum, which is a sort of parallel translation into Aramaic of what's in the Pentateuch.
Early accordance.
Sorry?
An early accordance.
Yeah, yes, well, it's both a translation and has some expansions.
The commentary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to show you an example of that here, this is from the Targum Jonathan on Numbers 21. And don't worry about the Hebrew, but that's just what was on the webpage I took it from. And it's dealing with the question of when, in Numbers 21, God says to Moses, tell the people to come and I will give them water to drink. Okay. But in the Targum, not only does God give them water to drink, but the supply of water, and I can't, my screen is covered up, but it actually goes to each person at the door of their tent, serving the water, tent by tent, which is pretty neat when you're in the desert. Okay. So you've got this amazing rock which Moses has cracked open and is spewing water everywhere, turning the desert green. But it's actually going along from house to house, tent to tent to tent, 2 million people, okay, going from tent to tent, dropping off water like the milkman used to do when I was a kid. Okay. Now, Paul picks up on that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Okay? I don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual drink, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. It's the rock that goes from tent to tent, and as they move around the wilderness, goes from place to place. And that rock was Christ. So Paul not only knows the Midrash about the miraculous rock that followed them through the desert, but he actually turns that rock into Christ. And so he's not only knows the Midrash, he's using the Midrash and giving it another twist for the sake of his Greek audience in Corinth. Okay, and the Corinthians were not known for their Old Testament scholarship. Actually, wasn't what their reputation was based on. So again, we see this process of text of scripture, the Aramaic Targums, because in order for people who basically can't read and write anyway, only the scribes could read and write. Typically, even the ruler wouldn't be able to read and write. They might be able to read, but writing was a totally different skill. It's like typing or doing shorthand. It was a different kind of skill, which the boss didn't necessarily have in quite recent time. So you've not only got the literature being shaped and then translated into Greek, but for those whose first language is Aramaic, we get effectively a translation into Aramaic with additional comments and explanations. It's like a study Bible. And she'll joke about accordance. I mean, it's the story of the Old Testament, but it's actually, or the Pentateuch, but it's actually elaborated in various ways as well. And that's, of course, called Midrash. But all of that, I mean, the existence of Midrash and the existence of an Aramaic Targum is further evidence that of this reception process. So you've got a sacred text, but you're still in a culture where most people can't read and write. So the text still has to come to life orally. And that's what the Targum does. And Paul could assume that his audience in Corinth would actually know that story, which is very interesting. Well, I find that sort of stuff interesting. I'm probably a bit sad.
It's so different to, you know, if someone were to use a contemporary anecdote today to make a connection to something, because, you know, it's in our sphere of understanding. So it makes sense, I guess.
So the Targums and also the other deuterocanonical literature, or just straight out apocryphal literature, they develop these legends, because legends are one of the ways you make the tradition relevant to people.
And memorable and all that.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
All right, so I want to switch gears for a moment and talk a little bit about lectionary stuff. But any further reflections on what we'll be looking at in terms of the reception history for the Pentateuch? Standing aside for silence, or writing your assignments, as the case may be. Okay, so let's have a look at the lectionary side of things. Whether it's possible to move the screen, but can't do it. So one of the interesting aspects about the Pentateuch is that within the synagogue, and from fairly early times, but we're not 100% sure how soon this started to happen, the Torah, the Pentateuch, has been divided up into 54 portions to be read over the 54 weeks of the Jewish year. Okay? Because we're talking about a lunar year, not a solar year. And we also have 52 weeks, but we play with them in various ways with those, because we've got 13. There are 13 lunar months in a calendar year. We organise a few extra days here and there and so on. So they had and still have a festival called Simchat Torah, which is 8 days after the Festival of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot, and that occurs in late September, early October, just depending on, you know, the actual date of the new moon, all that sort of stuff. So they have a cycle which begins and ends with Simchat Torah. They have a 1-year cycle where they read everything in the Pentateuch. And along with the Pentateuch, they would have a set passage from the prophets, which is called the Haftorah. So again, this idea that you have like a controlling text, and then you have a secondary body of text which you're going to read in parallel with the first text. So the, if you like, the the structure of the lectionary is ancient and it's originally Jewish before it becomes a Christian thing. Now, there have been a couple of scholars who have suggested that the Synoptic Gospels in particular, and this is quite often was argued about Matthew, was written in order to provide a Christian text to go with the Torah passage. One of the problems with, as I see it, with that proposal is, A, we don't actually know what the first century Jewish lectionary was. And secondly, none of the Gospels start in the right place. The basic structure of the Gospels is essentially the baptism of Jesus through his public ministry, and Matthew and Luke have a little bit of sort of preface to do with the infancy narratives. But the logic of the gospel, of the Synoptic Gospels, is not starting at Rosh Hashanah and moving your way around through the Jewish year. So I find those proposals interesting but not persuasive. I just can't see that the Gospels line up that way. But there have certainly been some scholars that have argued that case. What we get in the Revised Common Lectionary, so in the older days, and like in the old prayer book, 1662 prayer book, you had the collected epistles and gospels for each Sunday, but basically it was a 1 year cycle. You had the collect of the day, which became the collect of the week, and you had the epistle and you had the gospel set for that week. And you didn't read from the Old Testament at all in terms of the Sunday Eucharist. That was because everybody was supposed to come to morning prayer and do the litany before they went into the Holy Communion service. So they got their dose of Old Testament. But in the Eucharist, it was simply epistle and gospel, which, if you think about it, is very similar to the Jewish tradition of Torah and Haftarah, Torah and prophets, with Torah and gospel being the defining canonical text, and then the epistle or the prophets being a secondary text that's in conversation with the primary text. In more recent decades, we've had what's called the Revised Common Lecture. After Vatican II, we had the Common Lectionary, came out from the Catholic Church, and it was a 3-year cycle, and it proved very, very popular with non-Catholic churches who went, yay, this is great. And then at a subsequent point, 20 or 30 years later, you get the Revised Common Lectionary. The Catholics are still using the Common Lectionary. Everybody else is using the Revised Common Lectionary. And most weeks, they're more or less the same, especially during Lent and Advent and Eastertide. What you do in the other Sundays is a bit more scope for flexibility. Now, in the Revised Common Lectionary, there's approximately, and this is just a rough rule of counting, approximately 158 chapters that you will never hear read in church on Sunday morning. So I went through the other night, added them all up, again going through that lectionary file, and obviously there are some times when half a chapter is there and half is not, or a couple of verses are not, but I've just tried to average it out and allow for a bit of unders and overs. My way of counting, there's about 158 chapters from the Pentateuch that I'm missing. So 35 of the 50 chapters in Genesis will never be read in church. And the bits we get in the Revised Common Lectionary in the case of the Common Lectionary, the Old Testament reading would be chosen to fit with the Gospel. So it was higgledy-pig every week. You jump from one bit of the Old Testament to the other. What we've done with the Revised Common Lectionary is we tend to read several passages from the Old Testament in sequence. Right? So we might have several weeks where we're reading bits of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob. but we don't read every episode. At least we have 6 or 8 weeks or so where there'll be a kind of a chronological sequence rather than just picking up a paragraph from here and a paragraph from someone else. So that's part of the architecture of the DNA of the Revised Common Lectionary. So I was surprised that 35 of the 50 chapters in Genesis would never get any airtime on a Sunday morning. Now, some of them are obvious. We're not going to read the rape of Dinah or whatever on Sunday morning. Perhaps we should, given sexual abuse in the church. But what did surprise me is actually how little of the Joseph story is ever read in the lectionary. We get it in Sunday school, we get it in morning prayer or evening prayer or whatever, but I was actually quite surprised the other day when I was doing this, and I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Basically, Joseph hardly gets to go, and yet everybody knows, supposedly, the Joseph story. 32 of the 40 chapters of Exodus have dropped through the cracks. 23 of the 27 chapters of Leviticus, that's no great surprise. And obviously in Exodus, it's the chapters between 21 and 40 where you're not going to get much in the lectionary. And 35 of 36 chapters, I don't think that's, yeah, no, that's correct. That's not a typo. There's hardly anything from Numbers, obviously. And 33 of the 34 chapters of Deuteronomy don't get read in the lectionary. So, all of which I found kind of interesting. And so one of my patterns has always been, if I'm looking at the reading, particularly if it's a section of the Gospels or whatever, and not only, not talking about where the whole story is left out, but sometimes a paragraph in the middle of the reading is left out.
Yes.
And I'm one of those preachers who goes to have a look to see, well, what's left out here and why did they leave it out? And should I perhaps be saying something about that in my sermon, even just approach? Don't forget, there's another bit to the story which we're not hearing today. You need to remember that as well. So as a preacher, I've always paid attention to what was left out of this week's lectionary, as well as what's in this week's lectionary. But sometimes that can be quite interesting. So that gets, obviously behind that process, there are some principles as to what sort of passages are included and so on. And as we know, in the case of the RCL, the focus is on Matthew, Mark, and Luke in each of 3 years. John gets a bit of a go during Eastertide and during Lent. We tend to read the epistles more or less all the way through. So we'll read virtually the whole of Romans over 3 months or something, 1 year. Another year we'll do Hebrews or whatever. And the Old Testament is at least it's not being read. Well, obviously we're not getting the whole, even of the Pentateuch, we're not getting the whole of the Old Testament. But the bits we're getting are at least now in a sequence. The storyline is being preserved, even though we're not getting all the detail. And we tend to leave out the gory bits and the embarrassing bits and so on as well.
It's quite noticeable, isn't it, in morning prayer when you're doing the Psalms? And we might get a Psalm that goes chapter 1 to 6 and chapters 9 to 10. There we go. And 7, 8, and 9, you don't want that bit?
Yeah, well, that's
the awkward bit.
That's the question of the imprecatory psalm, where there's a cursing element in the Psalms. And I guess there's a little bit of that in the Pentateuch, but generally speaking, the Pentateuch doesn't have quite as much of that sort of stuff. There's a bit of ethnic cleansing here and there, but I'm not quite the blessed are they who take the little ones and dash their heads against a stone. So part of the Christian reception of the Jewish scriptures is how we deal with, and Jewish people have their own way of dealing with it, but in terms of their interpretive traditions and what's in the Talmud and the Midrash and so on. The Mishnah and the Talmud. But it's, we will have a different set of criteria as to what's going to be useful to read in church, for example. And we're just not as interested in all the details about setting up the sanctuary and the clothing of the high priest, all that stuff, and arrangements for different sacrifices and so on. That just doesn't interest us enough. But it still leaves open the question, if we say we're people who value the scriptures, at times we're pretty picky, pretty selective as to, and sometimes perhaps I wish we were more selective than some of the stuff. But that also gets into tricky space. I remember being quite shocked. I've grown out, I've got past it now, but I remember the first time, one of the first times I was at St. Oswald's Church in Adelaide, and fascinating community that I eventually became a part of. But the person got up to do the reading from the epistle, and before she started, she said something like the following: "The words we are about to hear do not represent the beliefs of this community. We're going to hear Paul telling wives to be submissive to their husbands, and that is not how we treat women in this parish." And then read Ephesians 5. I went, wow.
I've been in a service where a similar thing has been done.
Yeah.
It's done more contextually to say, you're going to hear actually, no, sorry, it happened after, because someone read it and then the priest said, I should have given a little bit of context to that reading before, and sort of made a joke too for, it was a lady who read it. It was, oh, Melanie, I can't imagine how you were feeling when you read that. You know, it was, she did it in a very, very good way, just to say, to then use it as an opportunity just to give the context of the community and the time and that kind of thing. So it wasn't done in the same way, that same vein that you said, but it's almost like that bit of contextualisation can sometimes help with those tricky passages.
And some people do that by putting some comment in the bulletin about the readings.
Yeah.
You know, there are various ways that we try and slice and dice that process. Of managing what we're going to be listening to. In that particular parish, certainly back then, they had a tradition where they had a liturgy committee, but there were so many people wanting to be on the liturgy committee, you could only be on it for 4 weeks at a time. And then you had to go off and other people would come on, and then in 2 or 3 months' time, you could get back on again. It's an absolutely fascinating community. So the people who came to the Tuesday night liturgy meeting were the priest who was presiding that week, the person that was preaching that week, and the parish priest, and then the people who'd been elected to work on the committee. And obviously the preacher and the presider wouldn't necessarily be there every time, but the parish priest, who was actually Bishop Bruce Rosier, was there every time. And they would discuss the readings, and they'd say, now, what's going on in our community? How do these texts speak to our community? Are we going to read these passages on Sunday? How much of them are we going to read? Who's the best person in our parish to read? They didn't have a reading roster. They would ring somebody up on Wednesday morning and say, the committee has decided you're doing the epistle on Sunday, and this is what we want you to say before you. So it was a grassroots kind of thing. But there was an incredible sense of ownership from the congregation about what was happening. And so much so, you really had to line up and take a number to get onto the liturgy committees. I've never been in a parish like that ever since, but it was absolutely fascinating. And there was a totally separate committee did the music, which was just weird.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment now. It's not like, we really need people to get involved and do reading. Does anyone come and your interest?
I was going to take you back to Jenny Simpson, who we both know and love.
Oh, yes.
Reverend Jenny Simpson. when she was at Grovely with the Paul taxi particularly, she'd actually make an announcement before the service. And she wouldn't talk about it. She'd just say, today's passages is going to be some challenging language.
Yeah.
I ask you just to bear with us and I will unpack that during the homily.
Yeah.
She says, but I'm just giving you warning now that you might find some of that.
Now does it too.
Yeah, might find some of the readings. Just let's discuss it during the homily.
Yeah.
And take it from there.
Yeah.
And then she'll walk off and start the service just to prepare people.
That's why when I was at Fortitude Valley years ago, I'm actually there this coming Sunday. I get to preach on Trinity Sunday.
Lucky you.
So,
I'm preaching this weekend too.
thank you, Ronnie. But we used to have mass several days a week, not actually every day, but almost every day. There'd be Eucharist at some time of the day. And I developed the habit there that even if there are only 3 or 4 people there, I always gave a short homily. If the scriptures are going to be read, then the scriptures have to be unpacked. You can't just drop a Bible passage on someone's head. And now we're going to pray for the church or whatever the world. You've got to stop and process what you've heard. So I would never do a Eucharist without a homily, even if it's fairly short. Always engaged with, if you've served the meal, let's put it out on the plates and deal with it a bit.
Mm.
All right. Okay. So the other thing as we move towards the wrapping up stage is just to unpack a bit more the Jewishness of the Torah. And it's, my Jewish friends would find it even funny that we're talking about this. Of course, the Torah is Jewish, but we've had 2,000 years of Christians having some degree of ownership of these traditions, and obviously Paul is a big part of that. Paul was a Pharisee, apparently. The Pharisees, and this again is all a part of the reception history, I guess, which I should have noted earlier. We don't exactly know when the Pharisees started, but it appears to have been during the Hasmonean period. And the pebble in the shoe of the Pharisees, the thing that really got them motivated, was to make the teaching and the practice of Torah relevant to the ordinary Jewish person in their own household, not simply as law for the temple. And so there's a phrase sometimes used that the Pharisees were the first century Methodists. They took the liturgy, they took the Book of Common Prayer, and they took it down to the grassroots, and that every individual person should be a person who's looking at holiness and prayer and discipleship and having their own sense of conversion. So despite the way 2,000 years of Christians have misrepresented Pharisees, so Pharisee and Pharisaical is a kind of synonym for hypocrite. That's could not be further from the reality of the Pharisees in the first century. And that's why they feature so much in the gospel stories, because the Pharisees and Jesus were actually, a lot of the time, on the same page. But they differed over some things. They drew the lines in slightly different places, but they were not totally unconnected religious phenomena. So certainly in Paul, we have a first century Jewish Pharisee who's writing, half the New Testament or a third of the New Testament or whatever, as things turn out. And the essence of the Pharisee tradition was to take the practice of Torah and make it something which was belonged to the average Jewish lay person and not to the religion specialist. That's also an example of reception history. It's going, if you like, from the Targums to the next level of practice, discipleship, in a sense. And again, remembering discipleship is not about believing stuff. Discipleship is about being under the authority of a master. being a student, disciple of the master, of the rabbi. And in modern church world, discipleship has come to be a synonym for evangelism and converting people. But discipleship is actually about a person placing themselves under the discipline of a particular teacher. And that's very much where the Pharisee kind of model came from. So we got this sense of the Torah as fundamentally, intrinsically a Jewish document, and we find it so easy just to Christianize the Old Testament, and that's a project that goes back at least to the time of Paul. And don't forget, Paul is writing his first letter, whether it's First Thessalonians or Galatians. He's writing that first letter less than 20 years after Easter. So this is very, very early in the Christian story. And so how we process Torah and Pentateuch, what sort of ownership of it we claim, is it itself, I guess, a particular subset of that larger issue about Old Testament versus Jewish scriptures, Hebrew Bible, whatever. My take on that is that even though my disposition is to say yes, yes, yes to Hebrew scriptures or whatever, my more thoughtful response is to say, no, they're actually not the same thing. Christian Old Testament is not the same thing as the Jewish Bible. Even simply the fact that the books are organized in a different sequence. It's like playing with the same deck of cards, but you're playing a different game. And in a sense, the Christian Bible, even apart from the extra 12 or 13 books in the Apocrypha, the Christian Old Testament is a particular arrangement of the Jewish scriptures based on the Septuagint and read through Christian eyes. So I find myself trying to juggle the Jewish dimension to this text and what it means as a Christian to read this text.
Does that mean, and because this is a bit of a childlike question, but if you take an example of Exodus, for example, does that mean that they are literally like slightly different translations, or it's the same text, it just is looked at with a different lens because it's in a different context with different, and it has other additional writings too, doesn't it? So if you put
the Christian Bible does, as in, again, if you're at the Queensland Theological College, the Old Testament is limited to the books that are in the Jewish canon. But for the Greek Orthodox and the Catholics, and actually the Anglicans, which is a lot of Christianity in that set of circles, those extra dozen or so books are part of the Old Testament.
Yeah. But if you looked at a discrete bit like Exodus, for example, is that, does it?
Basically, the translation is not the issue.
Yeah.
Historically, there might have been some tendentious mistranslations. Put it into the Jewish people a bit, but again, the Septuagint was essentially a Jewish translation, but it was that was the Greek Bible, which became the Christian Bible, and the Greek Orthodox are still reading from the Septuagint.
Yeah, right. Okay. But it's just that bigger compilation of how they're.
It's kind of oldie, worldy, Greeky.
Yeah. But
it's 2,500 year old Greek, but they can actually, with a bit of work, they can understand it. It's not so much the word. There'll be some words. For example, in Genesis 1, Christian Bibles will typically say, "And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water." A Jewish translation will tend to say, "A wind from God," because ruach can be spirit, and breath, and wind. And in fact, I would translate that as "and a mighty wind," because I would use the Elohim as a superlative rather than God, meaning a hell of a wind, a powerful wind.
Right.
Okay. But early Christian readers saw God the Creator, the Word, and the Spirit, and they saw that as a text that was Trinitarian.
Mm.
Jewish readers will not see anything about the Trinity in Genesis chapter 1. So it's not so much the words are different, but we look at the words through a different interpretive framework.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah. I haven't actually looked to see it's actually hard to get a Jewish translation of those books. That's not just in Hebrew. But if you look at the JPS translation and so on, which you can get in accordance.
Yeah.
That's something I always like to do,
Oh, that's a good one.
just to see how they translate. Just like I might look at a NIV and then cross myself 3 times. No, I mean, I'll deliberately look at an NIV to see how a group of scholars who've already decided what the Bible has to mean, and so they translate the words to agree with their theology. How are they dealing with this passage? Because they're people of good faith and goodwill. They're smart guys. I want to see how they're doing it. In the olden days, you got a Catholic Bible and a Protestant Bible. Now the NIV is the Protestant Bible. You can still get a Jerusalem Bible, of course, which is purely Catholic. Again, I like doing that to see what's in the New Jerusalem version. But actually, things like the RSV, it actually has Jewish scholars on the translation committee. It has an ecumenical and interfaith translation committee. And that's the way with the RSV and the NRSV, that's how it's been for my whole lifetime. That the English translation, which is kind of the benchmark, as it were, it's actually done by an interfaith committee. So you no longer get a denominational Bible translation. And even the New English Bible from ages ago sort of died out. I remember as a kid looking at the back cover, and it had the chief rabbi of Great Britain was on the translation committee for the New English Bible. So, because any Christian trying to translate, let alone exegete, the Old Testament, has to listen to how a Jewish person reads this text. It'd be weird.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we're going to read it in a Jewish way, but we certainly, I think we had to, I'm not sure privilege is the right verb, but it's their text first. The earliest, the original meaning. Now,
Showing respect to their text, isn't it?
showing respect. Now, of course, Rabbinic Judaism is not the original Judaism.
Yeah.
So Rabbinic Judaism is already a reaction to Christianity.
Yeah, okay.
So a rabbinic reading of the Old Testament is not innocent of any agenda. So we shouldn't think that the Jewish thing is always the only way to read it. But I would say the Jewish perspective on the text is always worth hearing. And I hope they would feel the same, that, that's how you read that text. That's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
So there's a yeah.
Richard Gray, a question. With the current state, as you described it quite nicely, I appreciate, what would the task of reading the text now is that for interpretation, either as a theologian or a New Testament scholar, as opposed to into right? Others attack it, quote unquote, as a theological task. Who should lead that run? The people in the pulpit, the parish, or scholars who are pointing the way? I'd like your thoughts if we could share some.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by leading the way.
So, in terms of lecturing and preaching, I would go to commentaries and borrow scholars, and they have their spin on the text, all the texts. You can go to many commentaries, or actually commentary written by scholars of Hebrew or New Testament. Then a year or so ago, discovered the Brazos, B-R-A-Z-O-S, theological commentaries. So I'm kind of digging around to find where to look for a current take rather than recycle stuff that I can use, suggest things for me and other people.
Part of the challenge that I find is that the more technical this commentary, the less it's going to have theological content, and particularly pastoral homiletical resources, because so much of the energy is going to go into obscure historical, linguistic, whatever issues. I must admit, I would rarely look up a commentary these days, but then I'm at the other end. I'm at a similar end of the process as you are, of course. But I mean, I know this stuff pretty well, and I'd be surprised if I actually had to go and look up a commentary other than I just wanted to go and remind myself of something. But if it's that obscure that I don't know it already as a professional biblical scholar, then it's probably not relevant to put into a sermon. The sermons are not masterclasses in obscure biblical scholarship. Sermons are pastoral encounters with the community gathered around the text and the table, as I see my role as a preacher. So I'm not dumbing it down, but I'm looking for some bitey edge, looking for a bit of cheese that has a bit of tang in it, a bit of bite. And the feedback I get from congregations is typically be something like, I like the way you make us think. Every time I come to church, if you're preaching, I know I'm going to go away with something to think about. Okay, now that to me is affirming my understanding of my role as a preacher. I'm not there to utter conventional truths that their Sunday school teacher told them. Sometimes you've just got to stand with people in grief and loss and tragedy. But I'm looking for the prophetic edge, and particularly for me, that's the Jesus edge to this. So I would typically preach on the gospel. I can get by most of the time without even looking at the epistle, because I'm not that interested in Paul.
I found
obviously
that over years, I rely on using the liturgical year as a theological map, and with that as a theological claim, then primary in the here and now, not way back when, and that's worked. But then after I got bored, you're like, okay. And then I did hear one lecture by a guy called Tom Long. He professor preaching at Callan. Was at Columbia Brisbane. He said in a seminar, a workshop of preaching, most people do not know anything of the Bible. So don't, stay with one text. Otherwise, they don't know when they walk in, And I thought, makes sense. 4 readings. How do you help people who know nothing, basically? Or
it depends what the benchmark is. So my role as a Christian educator is very different from my role as a preacher. Okay. Now, when I'm running the Dean's Forum after church at the Cathedral in Grafton, that's a teaching moment. And we'll have an hour of solid instruction on biblical history, whatever. But in the sermon, it probably doesn't matter whether they think Moses comes before Abraham or after David. Okay, that matters to us because we're theological students. But the average Christian doesn't need to know. And in case you're wondering, Moses comes in between, but just so I don't confuse anybody. But to me, it is actually really important. But this is because I grew up in a church where the preacher went for 45 minutes every Sunday. But for me, the sermon is a pastoral liturgical reflection, engaging with something that's going on in the life of that community or the life of that town or the life of the country. It's not a moment for teaching details of biblical scholarship. There are other times, I love doing that, but I don't do it in sermons. Now, I might have a throwaway line. I might like one. I remember one of my first Sundays in Lismore recently. I just reminded people, I just made a comment. Well, of course, in the Gospel of John, the enemies of Jesus are the Jews, as if Jesus and the disciples weren't Jewish. And this is reflecting the tension between the Johannine community and the Jewish people in the synagogue. It's not telling us anything about what was going on in the time of Jesus, sort of thing. But that's not. I wouldn't want to go much deeper into that in the context of a sermon. Same with the Pentateuch. I'll pick up themes that I think are speaking to this community. But I'm not going to be giving a lecture on any topic when I'm asked to preach. It's not a public address, not a public lecture, a professorial lecture. It's a sermon, and sermons are a very different genre, I think. There was something else, but now it has slipped my mind. Something else was along that line that I wanted to mention, but it's disappeared. Oh, no, so in terms of resources, what I don't find commentaries particularly useful. Some people do, they love them. When I sit down and read a half-inch commentary, I'm thinking, I could have written this. Why am I reading somebody else's? What I do find really interesting are web-based reflections that are, basically 1,200, 1,500 words, looking at a reading or looking at the set of readings. And one of the best people doing that, in my experience, is John T. Squires. He's a New Testament scholar, synoptic specialist, used to be on the faculty at United Theological College in Sydney, so part of CSU School of Theology, retired from that, back in parish ministry now. But he writes and edits With Love to the World, which is a weekly lectionary commentary online, posted by the Uniting Church in Australia. And I find John's stuff always super value. I don't know how he has the energy to put out so many. He'll publish not just on the gospel, he'll publish something on the epistle, he'll publish something on the Old Testament, whatever, in the same week. And now he and I are mates, we look at the world the same way, but I often find reading his stuff is a real stimulus when I'm getting ready to preach, rather than pulling a commentary down off the shelf. Again, going back to if it's that technical a point that I need to look up the commentary, maybe I shouldn't be talking about it in a sermon. Maybe it should be a workshop after church or something.
That's why we learn exegesis.
Sorry?
That's why we learn that same word.
Exegesis.
Exegetical skills, though, isn't it? That's why they teach us that, to be able to
do it in a sermon?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Oh, not exegesis, but to understand the passage so we can then put it into that.
Yeah, but you're going to end up right down at the end where you're doing meaning for today and application.
Yeah, to a contemporary, a story that we might tell, but understanding
Give us
the
a
meaning.
contextual understanding.
Yeah, there's no.
I wouldn't do an exegesis, and I was actually talking to my supervisor about this recently because I'm doing Trinity Sunday, and I've done subject. It's one of my other subjects, and I said I could just see. I know I'd never do this, but you can just see a sermon sitting there somewhere to say, academics for the last 2,000 years. Let's look at Athanasius and Gregory of Nyssa and Schleiermacher, my favourite.
Bit of bar
You just wouldn't do that. No, you wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But it gives you, understanding them gives you that ability to apply it then in the.
But it's like preaching at Christmas Day. Trinity Sunday is a bit like that, and Easter Day for that matter. I mean, there are some days in the church here when everybody knows what the topic is.
Yes.
But you've got to say something new about it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, and that's where reading a reflection, a commentary, or even just some other kind of theological piece or a poem.
Yeah.
Bit of poetry can sometimes be, from one of the Sundays that I was in Lismore, their stimulus was actually a letter from the Vice Chancellor of the University of Divinity, who was writing a piece. And I heard him give this talk a couple of times. It was what he was on about at the time. And Pete's a good friend of mine. But I mean, he was talking about the difference that theological education can make. He basically, it was his sermon at the service at the end of last year, whatever, or beginning of this year, whatever.
Yeah,
It was what he was talking about in that period. Like bishops, they have a confirmation sermon, they use it for 3 months or so, then they think of a new one. So Peter Sherlock had this thing about what difference does theology make? What difference to the real world does it make having people able to think theologically? And I took that to say, what difference does it make to Lismore that St Andrews is here and we're willing to think outside the box and not just go for black and white solutions? We can see things, we can look at the flood, but we can see a bigger story about the Lismore story because we've got perspective that comes out of theology. And then I sent him a copy of my sermon. I said, I thought you might like to know you were my text for my sermon in Lismore the other day. He was blown away.
You actually reminded me, I remember reading something, I can't remember what it is. I'm sure if I went back to my sermon, I'd have looked, but I read something in Anglican Focus. There might have been something even on Bishop Philip. Anyway,
So the stimulus point for a sermon might come out of a commentary. It might actually have come out of a conversation during the week with somebody at a nursing home.
Yes.
But I will tie it together in some way with probably the gospel. And try to earth it out in that what I perceive to be the dynamics of that community.
Yes.
Now there are people who have a more expository approach to preaching, and they do want to effectively do an exegetical sermon, and they go through phrase by phrase and unpack every line of thought in the Pauline passage as if that's pure gold coming from God. I just don't see scripture that way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
So I can rarely do an expository sermon.
As we're learning, about these things, it's good for us sometimes. Sometimes I find myself, I have to go to commentaries just so I can understand some of that meaning, but I won't do an exegesis, like I'm not a evangelical.
I like to go to the sermons as well. I read up other sermons, especially once I've read it, just to make sure I'm going in the right direction.
I do too.
To see what other people that are more experienced than me have got to say on it.
Yeah. And what I'm doing when I'm preparing a sermon, I'm listening, hopefully, to the Spirit and saying, so what's the angle? What's the prophetic word that I've got to present next Sunday to this group of people?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so a Holy Trinity on church, when they get their grumpy old rector from 40 years ago coming back to preach on Trinity Sunday, they don't want a lecture on the Trinity, and that's good because I'm not the person to do that. But I will offer some sort of reflection on how the Trinity is a model for Christian life. And that'll be not yet written, but that's kind of where I'm heading.
Here's mine.
Yeah, so, but to me, the sermon is always a prophetic. It's a chance to speak to the people in the name of God. That's pretty special. All right, so where were we we're actually over time because we've got to get ready for the next thing. So we talk about Torah, which is the Jewish word, of course, and Torah, like Pharisee, law, has been parodied by the Pauline thing about law versus spirit and the works of the law versus faith. And that's not fair. Paul, frankly, should fail exegesis in terms of how he treats the Old Testament. But he's doing that as a Jewish follower of Jesus. So we've been talking about this. How do we respect the Jewishness without also relinquishing the sense that there's a Christian way of reading these texts which has its own integrity and which has a proper humility in terms of the Jewish voice, the Jewish perspectives, without just, giving the game away and becoming funny Jews. So there will be passages we read differently, and there'll be lots of passages where there's no disagreement. And there'll be passages that are more integral to Jewish identity, like the texts about Yom Kippur and so on, and even the Exodus traditions, which are more, these are their story of who they are as Jewish people, and they just don't have that same level of significance for us as Christians. They're not the defining story. Whereas for us, I think, certainly for me, the defining story is what we find in the Gospels rather than what we find in Exodus. We talked earlier about what the lectionary leaves out, and that also indicates, I think that's the next point coming up, when we draw this distinction between the moral law and the ritual law, and we dismiss the ritual law as not being relevant to Christians, we introduce the idea that we've only got to worry about the ethical commandments, the moral commandments. We've actually taken a concept that isn't in the Bible and we've made it a sort of canonical test for what is in the Bible. And I don't disagree that as Christians we don't have a huge investment in all those chapters in Leviticus and Numbers, but I'm not sure that dismissing it as ritual is really a defensible way to go. Probably because the people who are most here doing that are also the people who are very negative towards any liturgical tradition. To be critical of the ritual laws is being on the same slippery slide, as it were, as saying, well, we don't need robes, or we don't need candles, or we don't need a church building, or we don't need ordained ministers, or whatever. All of which may be true. But I just have a suspicion, a concern, I guess, that it's too easy to say, oh, we're throwing that out because it doesn't fit with the way we do religion. For instance, people of more evangelical background go into the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and all they can notice is the noise and the chaos, and it's cluttered, and it doesn't look like a nice, clean, tidy Protestant church, because it's not. It's a Greek Orthodox church, and it's got several hundred years of sanctuary lamps and cobwebs and stuff everywhere. It's not a Protestant church, but they can't see it's a church. So they go down to the so-called garden tomb, which, guess what, looks and smells just like your local Baptist church, because guess who created it? They're both fine, but being able to recognize the integrity of the other tradition, I think, is really important, and not just say, oh, that's ritual. Because the same people who are saying that would say that everything in the Pentateuch is given to us by God, but most of it we can ignore. So because it was only for the Jewish people before Jesus came or something, all of which is an idea that they don't get out of the Bible itself. So finally, just these are essentially the big questions, and we've run out of time, but I'm going to raise some of them with Richard Sewell shortly. This idea that the subtext for this unit is becoming the people of God, looking at Pentateuch through the lens of becoming the people of God. So the texts themselves are generated by the process of becoming the people of God, but then the texts also shape the community. It sees itself as the people of God. And so the texts become a benchmark for authenticity and for reformation at different points in church history. But the church itself was there before the New Testament. Maybe not before the Old Testament, but certainly the church was there before the New Testament. So in the Septuagint, I think we see a Greek-speaking diaspora community looking for texts that they can listen to and understand their identity. In the Hasmonean period, if Adler is right, we've got a self-consciously Jewish community re-establishing itself around Jerusalem and taking the Torah as in a sense, the text that shape their community and provide the distinctive markers of identity and who's in and who's out. And of course, we get that in the early Jesus movement as they not only reinterpret and use the Old Testament, but as they generate new literature as well. I'm not going to go on to these other things. I just wanted to know in terms of how the Pentateuch functions, obviously there's all sorts of debates swirling around in terms of sexuality and gender boundaries. And it's not just what it is LGBTQ, but it's also the I and the A and so on. In other parts of the world, particularly in the US, it's all about creationism and science. And that's as hot a topic in some of the southern states as gender and sexuality. And of course, again, in the US and in Palestine, you've got the impact of Zionism and Christian Zionism as the primary driver of Zionism, and Christian apocalypticism. So the texts, ancient texts, are continuing to shape and even distort modern faith communities. And the most extreme example of that was probably the Jim Jones phenomenon in the 1970s, 1980s, the Jonestown thing, and the sort of wacko cult that was in Waco, Texas. These are violent, and just far more recently in Africa, we've had Christian prophets whose followers are starving themselves to death while the prophet lives in 5-star luxury. Hello, what's wrong with this picture? So the texts are still incredibly powerful, and the texts can reinforce, the text can be toxic, basically, as well as life-giving. And part of the challenge is to find ways to work with the texts that are life-giving, take the text seriously, but as the aphorism goes, not necessarily literally. So really take the text seriously, listening for what the Spirit is saying, and then looking at how it's working out in practice in a particular community. If people are being hurt, if people are being screwed by this expression of the faith community, there's something wrong with the faith community, even if it's very biblical. There's more to being Christian than being biblical. Anyway, we better stop there because in about 15 minutes we'll be having nibbles and stuff up in lecture room 1 for those of us that are on campus.
Is he doing a lecture as well over there? Is he with us, or is it just about?
We're having a chat in between the two classes.
Right. Okay.
So there's, as I understand it, there's going to be hospitality about 4:30.
Yeah.
And then from between 5 and 6, we're having a conversation. And then some of us will disappear, and Ruth's class will go on for their final lesson.
Oh, I must have not read something because I've got a meeting online tonight for the Ichthus camp.
There you go. All right, so I'm going to stop the
Thank you, Greg.
recording. That's the first thing I want to do here. Oh, I've got to get out.
Just thinking, Greg was saying about the
that screen share. Now I can